Constructive Voices, the podcast for the construction people, with news, views, and expert interviews.
Hello, I'm Steve Randall, and this is the first of 2 episodes bringing you our recent Biodiversity in the Built Environment event.
This is Constructive Voices.
Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to Biodiversity in the Built Environment, a special event from Constructive Voices, the first of several special events that we will be hosting this year, and this event the highlight of our Biodiversity Month. So thanks for joining us, and a big thank you to all of you who are on our panel, but also the many people who are joining us as part of the audience as well. Please, can I ask you to remain on mute unless you're asked to speak? In a moment, we'll meet our amazing panel of experts, but first I'm going to bring in a voice that if you're a regular listener to the Constructive Voices podcast, then you'll know his voice. Or, of course, if you're based in Ireland or have ever watched Ireland's biggest shows on construction, Pete the Builder, Peter Finn, TV builder, part of Constructive Voices, my co-host on the podcast. And Pete, good to see you.
Hey Steve, how's it going? Thank you very much for a very colourful introduction there. I really appreciate it. Just a very quick thing, guys. I just want to welcome everybody to our roundtable, and just let you all know that we're honoured and we're proud to have our platform being used for such an important meeting, and absolutely keep an eye out on more events that we're going to have throughout the year. So that's me. Very welcome to everybody, and I'm really looking forward to hearing everything.
Excellent. Good to see you, Pete, as always. Lots of people joining, which is fantastic. Thank you so much for being part of this special event. Now, Claire Wansbury is the expert on this. I'm here to keep everything flowing and to move things along and make sure that we keep as much to time as we possibly can. But Claire is the absolute expert on what we're talking about this afternoon, biodiversity. Claire, welcome, and perhaps you'd like to introduce yourself to the audience, please.
Thank you. Hi, yes, I'm Claire Wansbury. I'm Atkins Fellow and Technical Director at Atkins, which is a large engineering and environmental consultancy, part of the SNC Lavalin Global Group. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. Thank you to Constructive Voices for dedicating this time to biodiversity. So, Steve, shall I explain what we're going to do today and set the scene a bit?
Please do.
Cool. So, during our session today, once I've set the scene, I'll be introducing Roberta Boscolo, who'll be talking about her work at the World Meteorological Office. And after that, I'll be asking each of our other panelists to introduce themselves, say a bit about what they do, and then we'll go into the panel discussion. We'll make sure at the end that there's plenty of time for listeners to feed in their own questions, so it won't just be us talking to each other with everyone else listening. But what is this session all about, and why now? Essentially, we're living in a time of intertwined global emergencies of climate change and biodiversity loss. We need to resolve both for the sake of our natural world and ourselves. There's rightly a lot of publicity about the global targets, agendas, and action on climate change, but far less talk about biodiversity. Yet nature is our greatest ally in the fight against climate change, and it supports our individual health and well-being, and also supports so many of aspects of our economy. In December of last year, In December of last year, the United Nations brought governments together in Montreal for COP15, the 15th Conference of the Parties of the Convention on Biological Diversity. This convention was created in Rio in 1992, and there have been goals and targets set at various intervals since then. The task in Montreal was to set a set of goals that are going to turn the corner, take us from a time of nature loss to nature recovery, setting a vision for a nature positive future. The meetings in Montreal were actually the final step of nearly 2 years of negotiation, but they did have an outcome, which was the Global Biodiversity Framework. The framework contains 4 long-term goals, where we need to be by 2050, and 23 targets where we need to be by 2030 to have changed course and be heading towards those long-term goals. So this global biodiversity framework, is it as ambitious as some campaigners hoped? No, but it is ambitious. Is it guaranteed to work? No. If you look back, so many of the goals that we've set ourselves for each decade under this convention have just been missed. So it's a big ask. And it's not perfect. There's some bits that maybe could be clearer, some bits that aren't mandatory that some people would have liked to make mandatory. But it sets us a challenge which actually is achievable. It also captures the sense of urgency. We need to understand, we need to commit, and we need to act. One thing at COP15 in Montreal that was new and quite different from some of the climate conferences is that the business world was really visible there. Not nudging governments and quietly calling on them to do less and don't sign us up, saying to governments, do more, saying we want mandatory targets to create a level playing field. We want action. Business wants action on nature because we can see inaction putting our businesses at risk. Essentially drumming home the message that looking after nature is sound business sense. So that, in a nutshell, is why we're here, to help us all learn more as we recognise and respond to that call for action, to be part of that change of direction towards nature recovery. So I hope that's given you a flavour for why we're here today. And I'm going to now invite Roberta to introduce herself and say a little bit about where she works. And then I'll ask a few questions of her, and then we'll introduce the rest of the panel. So Roberta, good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Claire, and thank you for inviting me to this roundtable and to share our experience with such a distinguished participant. So I'm Roberta Boscolo, and I'm a science lead for climate and energy at the World Meteorological Organization. So the World Meteorological Organization is a specialized agency of the United Nations and is also the authoritative voice for weather, water, and climate. The headquarters is in Geneva, Switzerland, and this is where I am now, and I've been here since 2009. So especially my work here focus on how to harness the power of the climate data and the information that we generate in support of decision-making of key sectors. And for me, is actually, my focus is on the energy sector. So about 10 years ago, WMO spearheaded an initiative called the Global Framework for Climate Services, and to make sure that the information that we generate as an agency is used for climate adaptation, mitigation, and the public and the private sector. We realized back 10 years ago that there is a disconnection between the community of the data and information providers like us and those who actually should access this information and should use it to develop their climate resilience strategy or optimizing the carbonization strategies. So my work is to connect with all these stakeholders to make sure that the climate services cycle is not broken, and we keep providing better services and better value to the society. Finally, I just want to say that our vision in the World Meteorological Organization is a global And one of my focus is also to create capacity in those countries, especially the developing countries, that don't have the capacity of the developed countries to serve some key sectors. And I help them to access and use the climate data and develop information which is tailored for the national needs.
Thank you, Roberta. That was a great introduction. Got a few questions to explore. The first one is actually about thinking of COP15 on biodiversity. That really did have a hugely increased global profile, but action on biodiversity loss is still at a much earlier stage than action on climate change. We know we need to do more on climate, but do you think there are lessons from the efforts on climate change that can be shared with those who are striving to get momentum and awareness around biodiversity loss?
Yes, so actually, I think there are key lessons to learn, but just let me say that we can also argue that the negotiation of the climate change are also not progressing as fast, at least as fast as the scientists recommend, in order to avoid the most devastating consequences of climate change. But yes, I agree that, you know, this COP, especially the one in COP15 on biodiversity loss in December, generated a significant increase of global awareness and also attention to the issues of biodiversity loss. And as you pointed out, a significant action to address these issues is still on the early stage compared to, I think, to the climate change. But there are certainly, as I said, lessons from that we can learn from what is happening in the climate change sphere. And one important lesson is the need for a strong, consistent messaging about the urgency of the issue and the potential consequences also of inaction. These messages can be used to engage with the public and the political and to build political support for the action. And also, I attended several COPs of climate change in the last few years. And my take is that in these gatherings, negotiation among the parties or the countries are just one part of the whole event. And while these governments struggle to reach sometimes a meaningful and bold accord, the other actors like businesses, civil society, academy, and NGO are pushing for great transformation. So another important lessons, as you said before, is the need to build a coalition of stakeholders for different sectors and disciplines to work together towards a common goal. These include, as I said, civil society organization, the private sector, the scientific community. And it's also important to acknowledge that addressing biodiversity loss will require a wide range of solutions as well. And these solutions are also in the sphere of policy, legislative measures, economic incentives, and community-based approaches. And finally, I think monitoring and reporting on the progress in addressing biodiversity loss also is crucial for measuring progress, identify the areas where additional action is needed, and for holding governments accountable and other actors accountable. So it is true that both COPs are not, the changes are not happening as fast, as I said, as fast as the scientists are recommended. But I think we can learn from each other and to get better, while we go forward to this diplomatic in this diplomatic world.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. What are your thoughts in terms of the impacts on the environment and how we deal with them, about the interaction between climate change and loss of biodiversity from your own work?
Yes, so the interaction between climate change and loss of biodiversity is a complex and interrelated issue with significant impacts also on the planet and also in the human society. Climate change can have a direct impact on the biodiversity, for example, by altering the range of distribution of species, their migration patterns, their reproductive success, and also pushing for changes in the timing of the life cycle of events such flowering and migration. So climate change can also cause shifts in ecosystems, altering the balances of the species and leading to changes in the composition and the structure of ecosystems. And on the other hand, loss of biodiversity can exacerbate also climate change. Mm-hmm. So, for example, by reducing the capacity of the ecosystem to sequester the carbon and regulate local and regional climates. For example, deforestation and other form of land use are significant sources of greenhouse gases emissions. And the loss of carbon-rich peatlands and forests and grassland can lead to substantial emissions of CO2 and other greenhouse gases. So what I say is that, the relationship actually between climate change and biodiversity loss is multidirectional, mm-hmm. and have impacts which are not just limited to the natural world, but have also important implication on the human society as well. And addressing both of these global challenges will require an integrated collaborative efforts from all sectors of society. And as I said before, we need to have a vision which includes also governments, civil society organizations, private sectors, and also individuals as well.
Thank you. And with your own work, you're obviously very deeply involved in the scientific study with climate. And in the same way that we're recognizing the climate change and biodiversity losses, emergencies are sort of intertwined and we need to deal with them both. As well as finding solutions, there's also scientific research to understand the challenges and record change. How do you see the scientific studies of nature helping our understanding of climate change and potentially vice versa as well?
Sure. I think, this is a very interesting question. And it goes back to actually what I said before, because I think the scientific studies of nature, plays a very crucial role in understanding climate change and its impact on the natural worlds. So research in the biodiversity, ecosystems, and their functioning help us to better understand the interaction between species, ecosystem, the physical and the chemical processes that regulate the Earth climate. And this research provides important information about the ways in which climate change is affecting the natural world and the way in which changes in biodiversity and ecosystem can impact also the Earth climate system. I was recently reading an article regarding the Amazon forest degradation and the fact that such forest destruction can push this ecosystem to a tipping point and to a critical transition to a dry state. And such new states have a global impact, not just in the region of the Amazon. And because there are teleconnection with this kind of tipping point area with others tipping points in other parts of the world, and which are elements, critical elements of the Earth system. And they found that the Amazon rainforest area is connected, for example, to the Tibetan plateau, which is known as the third pole, and is providing water to all the region and of the Asia, many countries in Asia, and also the West Antarctic area. So this is how, you know, the system is really interconnected, and we need to be careful to look at it in a very comprehensive way. So similarly, research in climate change can inform our understanding of the biodiversity loss. For example, the impacts of climate change on species distribution, mitigation patterns, reproductive success can help us to better understand ways in which climate change is affecting biodiversity and ecosystem, and also can inform us on how better we can develop targeted conservation strategies and prioritize areas for conservation actions.
Thank you. Thank you, Roberta. That's been really insightful. That's been a great start to the afternoon. Roberta will be staying for the panel session, but I'm going to now invite each of the panel members to have 5 minutes to introduce themselves, say a little bit about their own work, and maybe if they've got any sort of high-level take on what they were thinking in the run-up to the COP15 meeting last December and their feelings on the framework that resulted from it. And I'm going to turn first to Jane Manley, who's the CEO of the Earth Trust. And I won't tell you what the Earth Trust is because I know she's about to tell us all about it.
Hi, and thank you. I mean, it's great to be part of this panel today. Really delighted and actually honoured to be in such a steamed conversation as we're having today, but highly relevant. I've got a series of slides to help you understand a little bit more about the Earth Trust. I have to say that the Global Biodiversity Framework is hugely important to the work of the Earth Trust, but we are quite a long way from global discussions in terms of what we do, although what we do is obviously highly steered by the global conversations that are happening. So thank you. I'm just going to say thank you as we move from slide to slide. So I'm Chief Executive of the Earth Trust, and the Earth Trust is a local organisation, a UK-based charity that champions access to green space. And the reason why we champion access to green space is for the benefit that access provides to people's health and well-being, to their decision-making around biodiversity and their decision-making around climate. Thank you. Next slide. So this is our strategy. It is, we need a society where everybody has access to green space and can benefit from green space. And it's important that that access is as easy as possible, but also that through that access, people gain a more deeper and meaningful connection with the environment because, next slide, please, it is people that are at the heart of all decision-making in wherever you are across the globe. It's people whose action and whose voices will determine whether or not we succeed. The targets themselves, a little bit of reflection for me first before I get onto some really good projects that we have done in the past. I just want to reflect on the Global Biodiversity Framework. I think going into the COP, I didn't have enormous hope for what was likely to come out, but actually for Earth Trust and our work, it is hugely important. So I just want to draw the attention of the panel to 4 key agreements that were reached. Firstly, 30 by 30. I think we will hear a lot more about that in the next conversation. There are targets around reducing pollution. There are targets around corporate reporting, and a significant expectation that there will be a greater increase in financial contribution towards biodiversity. I think what's really missing in terms of the conversation is putting people at the heart of decision making and putting people at the heart of access to biodiversity. Because as I said, for the Earth Trust, it's people and their connection with the natural world that's going to make a big difference. So that translation of global targets into local action and providing those policy levers and those opportunities and the frameworks and the funding to enable people to make the right decisions is crucially important. And I've got a few examples. Next slide, please. Got a few examples of where we've made a big difference here in the UK. So firstly, this is a discussion about construction, and during COVID, we built a new building, designed and constructed a new building. And this building is called Earth Lab. It's a connection with the natural world for many young people. It's built giving a sense of place and location in an engaging, as an engaging manner as possible. But it also stretches construction materials, it stretches supply chains, it stretches us and our thinking about how to build constructively construction in future. So how to build sustainably in future. Next slide, please. Secondly, I just want to give another example. This is River of Life. So this is a big construction project, still within the working landscape that we care for in South Oxfordshire, and it is the largest wetland creation project on the banks of the River Thames. Hugely important. All our projects contribute to biodiversity targets, but also contribute to climate targets, as well as to people's health and well-being. Next slide, please. And finally, I just want to draw your attention to one of the key strands of the COP targets, which is around investing more in the future. And in 2013, we set about becoming part of a different partnership whereby the predecessor to biodiversity net gain was developed. It was called biodiversity offsetting, and funding from a development actually was directed at improving chalk grassland, chalk downland here in South Oxfordshire. So several years on, we have now proved that funding that comes from a different partnership, from a developer, can actually contribute significantly to biodiversity delivery on the ground. Thank you.
Thank you, Jane. That's just been a really inspiring snapshot of examples. That was great. I'm next going to hand over to Chris Gerard from Anglian Water and invite you to introduce yourselves and say a bit about what you do and your thoughts on biodiversity.
Thank you very much, Claire. It's great to be here today, and I look forward to the discussion that we have over the next hour or so. So I'm Chris Gerard. I'm the Catchment and Biodiversity Manager at Anglian Water. Anglian Water is one of the UK water companies. We cover about a quarter of England in a part of the country which is particularly vulnerable from a biodiversity perspective. We cover the eastern side of the country, north of London. We're a low-lying part of England. We have only 2/3 of the average rainfall in the UK, and we have a soft, low-lying coastline, and we have about half of England's most valuable farmland in our region as well. All of that means that historically the biodiversity in our region has been significantly impacted. A lot of conversion to agriculture, a lot of loss due to the growth of towns and cities and roads and rail across our region as well. And it's very vulnerable to the impacts of climate change and continued growth. So we have a lot of challenges as a business to carry out our water and water recycling services for our 6 million customers, but do that in a way that supports and enhances biodiversity and indeed the communities that we serve. I guess that when we approached COP15, I was interested and hopeful that it would get a higher profile than previous biodiversity COPs have had. And as you said, Claire, I think that did prove to be the case. And part of that was perhaps because we were emerging from the pandemic, and certainly in England, the pandemic lit a bit of a light under people's interest in their local biodiversity. Where can they go and get their exercise? Where can they see wildlife? Where can they get some green space? So I was hopeful that we would have some a good outcome from COP15, and I think that's what we got on the whole. The goals and targets that were set are pretty comprehensive and maybe lacking in detail in some parts, but nevertheless cover the sort of key areas such as protecting species and restoring habitats, ensuring the benefits that nature gives to humans continue to flow, addressing things like invasive species and pollution, and supporting communities and people around the world to get an equitable share of that biodiversity value. So I was quite happy with, on the whole, how COP15 ended. But as you said, Claire, the targets have been set and missed in the past, and so I'm really particularly interested in, so from a UK perspective, what we do here to bring those targets into concrete plans of action so that we can work together to actually achieve those targets. I'm also somewhat optimistic, I have to say, because we have in the past had a new Environment Act, we had a new Agriculture Act, and that is hopefully laying a bit of a foundation for some of the things that we need to see happen for nature's recovery. So if we have a well-planned and well-resourced agri-environment program that farmers can buy into, if we have biodiversity net gain that works, that allows developers to make meaningful contribution to nature recovery and allow for growth, then hopefully we'll be able to make much more progress on these targets than we have on previous ones. I guess to finish off from Anglian Water's perspective, we're obviously a construction company as well. We build pipelines, we build water treatment works, and so on. And we do that largely to meet environmental targets. So if we have to improve the quality of water we're putting into a river, we often find ourselves traditionally doing something that impacts the environment in another way. If we pour a lot of concrete, if we use a lot of chemical, if we use a lot of energy to achieve a water quality objective, we're just driving climate change in the wrong direction as well. So my wish in this country and around the world would be that we really recognise this is a genuine nature and climate crisis, and that government gets behind mechanisms to allow the different parts of the economy to sort of zoom out from the problem right in front of their noses and really strongly collaborate. So we can partner up, we can co-fund, we can solve problems together. And I believe if we do it in that way, then we'll be able to make much more rapid progress on nature recovery, but also mitigating climate change as well. Thanks, Claire.
Thank you, Chris. That was great. One of the things we've touched on a couple of times spoken is the importance of nature to people's health and well-being. And our next panel member is somebody this is particularly relevant to, John Vasey from West Midlands 5G in the health and care sector. So John, I'll ask you to introduce yourself and say a bit about your own work and your thoughts.
Yeah, thank you, Claire. Like others, grateful to be on this panel and also to join the conversation later and to keep learning. I think that's key for me. I think Chris just touched on it. The ability to take a step back from the immediate problems is really what our organisation is trying to offer. Particularly in my area around health and care, how do we support organisations to do like Roberta was saying and look at the systems that are inherent in the challenges facing these areas, whether that's in construction and biodiversity, whether that's in how nature benefits people's health and well-being, or how it can also help in recovery and prevention or reduction of illness. And so we work predominantly in the UK, looking at how do we support people to understand their options and give them the space to think through the implications of those options. We're there to sort of facilitate that space and look at that. And so, today is another great example of that, where we get a chance to hear from a range of different people and take in and take on that advice and hear from it. And so, for me, that's kind of the lens I looked at COP15 through, as, you know, what more can I learn? How does this link to the areas of interest that we have around One Health, and that sort of overlap between how do you find that integrated approach to balancing and optimizing health of people, animals and the environment, and what are the trade-offs that you get with that, and therefore what are the chances that we can have those conversations with a range of people, either in the UK or in the supply chains that we work with overseas? How are we influencing, both in a negative and sometimes in a positive way, those decisions, and how are we, again, I think as has been said by Jane, you know, how do we make sure that people are at the centre of that? How do we make sure that it's still people that have the choice, but at least it's an informed choice? You know, they know what the consequences are of building in a particular way, you know, fighting for public transport in a particular way, looking at infrastructure and the landscape of infrastructure in relation to how they want to live in community, in society, and hopefully move away from, I guess, what seems to be being advertised, certainly in the UK, as the panacea of finding a way to be wealthy enough to exit from society seems to be our goal. And for some reason, I'd like to work on reversing that and actually being, how do we contribute to society? How do we contribute to nature and be part of it and get all the benefits from being part of it, rather than thinking it's something to try and earn our way out of.
Thank you, John. And our final panel member today is Margarita Skarku from 2150. Margarita, would you like to introduce yourself and say a few words?
Sure, thanks, Claire. And yeah, echoing the other panelists, very humble to be part of this and to learn from everybody. So I probably come at this from a slightly different angle. I work at 2150, which is a venture capital fund. We're a climate tech fund, so very much focusing on backing technologies and companies that have a positive impact on climate and biodiversity. We see as an extension of that, and I can certainly expand on that in a moment, but also looking for a financial return. So, you know, very much see biodiversity as an opportunity from a financial point of view, but also for climate from many different angles. I'm originally civil and environmental engineer, so this sort of intersection of the built environment and this topic is very much something I'm interested in. Spent a long time in finance, and as part of that career, got to work on things like TCFD and saw the beginnings of TNFD from inside a large bank. And what does that mean? And how do we start to even think about monitoring and reporting on nature? And so that's also been a very interesting sort of narrative and evolution to observe. I mean, I guess I won't comment too much on COP15. I think everything's already been said. The main point I would echo is that it's great that we have this commitment. Now let's actually do something about it, because I think on the climate COP, you know, we've seen that, yes, there was a big sort of patting on each other's back after Paris, and there has been some progress made, but you know, to talk about the UK, we're not on track whatsoever to hit those commitments. And again, you know, there's a lot of patting on our backs when we were the first country to legislate the commitments, but actually, unless you achieve that, it's completely pointless. And so I think that's the main thing. And you know, coming at it from a kind of venture capitalist perspective, where we do see the technologies that exist, we're very close to what's actually possible right now. There's a lot that's possible on sort of climate more broadly, but specifically biodiversity. And so let's actually kind of focus on implementing some of those solutions and being quite ambitious so that we can avoid the sort of sixth extinction that we're on the route to right now. I think more broadly, and it does sort of link to that, a topic that I'm very interested in is, you know, how do you come up with a really consistent and user-friendly way to value some of these ecosystem services? Because at the end of the day, that is often what it comes down to, is actually being able to place a value. And particularly when you think about, you know, Roberta touched on it, but, you know, a lot of the large rainforests, which obviously provide a lot of value that has a very direct impact on weather patterns and on climate change. You know, what are the incentives if you're from a country, whether that's Brazil or Indonesia or the DRC, where there's a lot of social inequality, there's a lot of poverty, and, you know, you're being asked to preserve nature for the benefit of the whole world, but in reality, you know, you could be using that land to gain a much more direct and immediate sort of economic benefit. So that's a topic that I'm very interested in. I'm doing quite a bit of work with the UKRI on this topic as well, about how do you actually think about placing value on nature that is translatable in a very direct fashion.
Thank you, Margarita. I think that point about social justice between people, between countries, there's so much complexity to all of this.
Yeah,
it's really important.
And I think that was something that, I mean, I wasn't sort of obviously involved in negotiations, but I think that was a topic that came up even in the final moments of the COP15 agreement, where you had, you know, certain countries from Africa sort of saying, this is great, but we actually need more funds to preserve and conserve, you know, our natural habitats, and where's that going to come from? And to my understanding, there wasn't really a response. And so I really think that's sort of fundamental, because this is a global issue. I think every country kind of has the responsibility for its own land, but, you know, we do also need to think about it from a global perspective.
Constructive Voices, the podcast for the construction people.
Check out the next episode for our roundtable discussion.